Hey everybody, today I'm taking a look at Glasgow, which is a two-player only board game published by Lookout Games and designed by Mandela Fernandez Grandon. This one takes around 30 minutes to play on average. So the key mechanisms of this game are tile placement, resource management, and you've got a little bit of a rondel here as well. As you can see, the setup looks like this. We have this big wheel of tiles, and you've got two different types of tiles. You've got the ones with these people on, which is essentially how you're going to collect resources. And you've also got these architect tiles, which you visit in order to build buildings by cashing in the resources and getting victory points. And victory points is going to be the way you get, or the way you win the game. Each player is also going to have their own personal player board that looks like this, which basically shows the capacity in which you can store resources. So you can see at any time I can store up to 5 bricks, 4 steel, 3 gold, and 1 of these wild barrels. Now, the way the game is going to work is going to be rather simple, where the person furthest back on the rondel is going to get to move their player piece onto any of the available spaces. And you cannot share them unless you are on one of these architect tiles where there's 2 spaces. But let's just say this blue player wanted to land in this spot here. Therefore, they would take a brick and a steel, and then they'll place that onto their personal player board like so. Again, putting the matching resources on the matching spot. Now, because they are forward in the queue now, whoever's furthest back gets to go next. So therefore, this player might want to maybe take the steel, or maybe take a gold, or maybe even take some of the other actions to refresh buildings, or take maybe one of your choice, or get a double action here, or this one even lets you activate previously built factories, which I'll explain later. So you've got this idea of how far do you want to go, because you won't get another turn until you are overlapped by the other player. But let's just say the green player went here and took one of these gold coins into their personal player board, and then it'll be the blue player's turn again, and so on until you've collected enough resource in order to build a building. So let's say the green player visited this architect because they had the intention of building this tile here, and to do that they would spend their 3 brick from their personal board like so, put it back into the supply, and then they can take that tile and place it somewhere on this city in the center of the table. Now, this city is going to be communally built between you and your opponent, and it's going to eventually consist of a 4x5 grid. And when you do that, you're going to, once you've paid the resource, you can place it anywhere you want, but you're going to put the arrow pointing towards you to show that that building belongs to you. And these buildings are all going to score in different ways. So for example, this one here that I've just built is always going to get me a point at the end of the game. But also if I build it in a corner of Glasgow, then I'm going to get an additional 5 points. So these ones are really good towards the end of the game, where you know what the grid is going to look like and you can get it snuck into those corners. You've also got ones like this, where the more you build them, or that type of building, you're going to get more points based on a sliding scale. You've got ones that are just straight up victory points. And again, you've got another one in the corner here. And you also have these factories. And these factories are kind of one of the key mechanisms of the game. So let's just say in a future turn, the blue player built on this row here, or this column here. You're going to have a look at any factory, which again, these shaped buildings, in that row or column, and then depending on who the owner is of that building, they're going to get the depicted resource. So you can see here that the green player would get a steel resource just passively, and the blue player would get one of these barrels, which is a wild resource. Additionally, if you want to build multiple buildings in a single action, you can do so, but for each time you do, you're going to have to spend an additional gold coin. And that is essentially how the game is going to work. Who is furthest behind on the time track takes the next turn, collecting resources, cashing those resources into build buildings. And once that 4x5 or 5x4 grid is complete, then final points are going to be tallied, and the person with the most victory points is going to be the winner. Now, there are a few other buildings which I didn't touch upon earlier, such as these ones here, which offers endgame points based on resources you have left over. So this one says for each gold coin I have left, I'm going to get a bonus 3 points, or for bricks, I'm going to get 1 point. And these ones here mean that for each set of the different types of buildings, you're going to get a bonus 10 points. And this one here is for if you have like duplicate buildings next to each other of this type, then you can score a bonus 3 points, or even this one here, which gets you 2 points for each factory you have. Okay, so let's get into the review of Glasgow. So you can probably see there from the little demo that this game has a lot of things that feel quite familiar to games of this type. General resource management, but I do like the fact that you do have a strict capacity on what you can keep, meaning that you have to play quite efficiently, especially when it comes to things such as the factories in the center of the table, because if you're placing a tile and you'd activate a bunch of your factories, then you want to make sure that you're not wasting that and making sure you have the space to actually keep those resources in, again, and not to waste that move. The time track mechanism works quite well in this one. I think it's a cool kind of mechanism anyway, and I've not really ever seen it not land too well. That idea of going as far as you want, but not taking another turn until you're overlapped. But I would say that I never really felt like there was those big jumps or those big incentives to go really far on the time track because there's a particularly strong tile that you want. They're all pretty simple in what they do. Just get resources. There's like 2 brick ones here. There's just a brick and a steel. So there's some ones like this that let you convert goods into other goods, or this one here that lets you draw the next building, potentially take a resource from it, or even build it straight away if you have that ability. I suppose there's a little bit of a rush sometimes for particular buildings that come out. If you want a specific one, maybe you've got the one in the corner that you want to build, and before the other person gets there, you might take a little bit of a further jump. But generally, I felt that you were crawling along rather than jumping significantly, meaning that your opponent will get lots of turns. That didn't really happen too often in the games I've played of Glasgow. Now, one of the things that intrigued me most about Glasgow was the idea of building these factories. I love this idea of, when you're communally building the city together, when you place a tile, you can potentially be offering your opponent some resources. And that's going to make you think twice about some placements, because maybe you want to get a very particular tile in a corner, but that's going to activate a bunch of your opponent's buildings and give them a big influx of resources without doing any work. Now, I love that idea, that kind of spinning plates on what you're going to do, what's going to benefit you the most. But I would say that didn't really come across as well as I would have liked, because the resources generally are quite generous in how to get them, and you can gather them pretty quickly. I didn't really feel like there was that much of a desire or urge to keep building these factories, because you could just get the resources by other means anyway. And you're probably going to go more for the points, because the factories don't generally offer you many points, and they don't really pay the big dividends that you'd want them to. You'd rather just go for a big grab of points and win the game that way, rather than investing in some kind of resource gathering infrastructure. So yeah, I would have thought that this would have worked a bit better in practice, and it did fall a little bit flat, and I found that it was always neglected in favour of just getting victory points. So despite the game being up to scratch in terms of how it functions mechanically, I don't feel like it does anything new or terribly exciting. They are all things that we've seen before, and when it tries to do something a bit different in terms of the communal city building, it doesn't quite pull it off as I would have liked. Now, that being said, the game is quite snappy. It only takes around 30 minutes to play maximum, and there's not really any downtime either. You're pretty much always taking turns and grabbing resources quickly, converting them into buildings, and so on. But the decisions on the back of that didn't quite feel meaty or exciting enough. It pretty much just felt like gather, spend, and not really having too much depth or strategy into what you're doing. Just grabbing the next best tile and cashing in those resources. So I didn't really feel like there was a lot of things to explore here, lots of things to rack your brains over, or terribly difficult decisions to be made. I think the player interaction in Glasgow could be better, to be honest. I generally find that the best games to pull off this time track mechanism, the idea of the person behind keeps taking turns until they catch up, the best games of those tend to have certain locations to go to that are so juicy and so inviting to go to that you can't help but jump forward. But kind of in contrast to that, leave your opponent a bunch of turns to catch up, and understanding what the benefit or who's going to benefit the most out of each move is where it shines. This one, it always felt like there was an adequate option to be taken, and I always found myself just crawling along and not having that kind of thought space of what am I leaving my opponent here. It didn't really matter too much because there's always a next viable option. So I did think that kind of diminished the interaction somewhat. I thought the tenseness of getting to certain spots on the board was okay in terms of the map. Maybe you're building a bunch of the buildings that work well by being next to each other, and then your opponent just ruins their plans by shoving something in the middle so you don't benefit anymore. So that kind of stuff is fine, but it just felt a little bit lackluster and didn't really shine to the point where I would have liked it. The production for Glasgow is generally fine. I've got no issue at all with the way that any of these tiles look. They're nice and clear in terms of their iconography. And the buildings themselves are all quite easy to work out what they do and how they score. And the resources themselves are decent. They're all different shapes. They're not just little cubes. And particularly the barrel looks good. So yeah, I've got no real issue with the production at all. And even the nice big chunky meeples are cool to play with. So yeah, for a little 2-player game in a small box, the production for this game is pretty damn good. I'm also not terribly impressed in relation to the replayability of the game. I don't feel like there's enough going on here to sink your teeth into, enough here to keep you coming back to this one. It's always going to feel like you're doing the same thing. Again, gather, spend, and take the best available building available to you. So yeah, I don't really feel like there's much scope to explore new territory, try new things, and to keep you coming back to this one, which is a bit of a shame. Okay, so final thoughts on Glasgow. So I suppose objectively there's nothing terribly wrong with this game. I just wasn't excited about anything this game offered. I felt like there's 50 games of this type already out there and I've already played it before I even had played it. So I suppose if you're looking for a very simple bare bones resource collection, resource management style game, then this one could be an option. You know, maybe if you play with a non-dedicated gamer partner or something. This is cool because, you know, instead of kind of cashing in these resources for points on contracts, you're actually building buildings communally to make this little bit of a puzzle and to score points in different ways. So I did like the idea and the concept here, but for me, I really would have wanted to see this factory mechanism exploited more and to be a more significant part of the game rather than just people ignoring it and going for the points instead. And that also ties to the time track mechanism. I've seen it done so much better in other games where that tension and that urge to push further is stronger. Well, in this one, you can just kind of trickle along at your own pace and just collect those resources without caring too much about what your opponent does. So again, all these little things just kind of detracted from me and made me feel like this one was a bit of a pass. Again, I'm not saying it's a bad game because it's not. For me, it's just not something special and not something I'd go out my way to recommend. It just feels like another game in a sea of thousands of them. So that is my final thoughts on Glasgow. Sadly, can't ultimately recommend this one.